Claudius Caesar, Augustus Germanicus, and we are not some shanty town. We are Rome. A new city. A Rome worthy of Rome.
All right, so hello and welcome to the second Myth of the 20th Century podcast, where we examine unanswered questions and questions with dubious answers of the last century. Our goal is to offer a fresh perspective on topics that still affect the course of events today, and in doing so, hopefully offer a counterpoint to the mainstream narrative on history so we can make more informed decisions going forward. Today we'll be examining a memoir entitled Inside the Third Reich by Albert Speer, published in 1969 after the author's release from Spandau Prison, where he was sentenced to 20 years during the Nuremberg trials for war crimes committed during the Second World War. During the period of Nazi Germany, Speer held two very notable positions, that of chief architect and then later as minister in charge of armaments production for all of Germany. It gave him a unique perspective not only into the inner workings of the Nazi regime, but also of Hitler himself. While in prison, Speer wrote this book in secret, much of which he kept hidden from the guards on scraps of toilet paper he stashed away in his cell. In many ways, it was his attempt to explain to others, as well as himself, just what had happened in Germany in the days before and during the war. Many have viewed it as a self-serving attempt to shift blame for his role during the war, while others have said it is an honest and careful reflection of what happens to a country in extremely serious times. My name is Endgame, and today I'm joined by my co-hosts, Ajax and Mr. Anderson. Say hello, gentlemen.
Hi, this is Ajax.
And this is Mr. Anderson.
So Ajax and I actually did read this book ourselves, and then Mr. Anderson was the guy who had all the questions. So with that, I'll let maybe Mr. Anderson jump in with something here. What do you think?
Right. So one of the things that I found interesting in both of your outlines, and thanks guys for actually reading the book, was the kind of process by which he ended up becoming the guy. So he makes a note that, like, you know, because the Nazis were essentially a quasi-revolutionary movement, even though they kind of assumed power via the standard mechanism of, like, they won at least a plurality of an election and they were, like, appointed to form a government. Their kind of leadership team was, like, incredibly thin on the ground and populated by a lot of guys who, like, their kind of primary resume item was they showed up to a rally early enough that they were, like, personally affiliated and, like, kind of personally compatible with, you know, Hitler or one of the other kind of elements of the ruling elite. But that this did not actually kind of generate that great of a leadership cadre. Like, it seems like, you know, from this book that Speer kind of considered himself one of the more, like, on the ball members of the kind of leadership teams, and, you know, kind of going into the war, he was a like architecture student. He was not magnificently kind of qualified, but, you know, he did get along very well just personally with Hitler. And was able to kind of leverage that into a series of kind of architecture jobs, and eventually culminating in being basically the complete like dictator of the German economy. I thought that process of kind of assuming power or, like, having power granted to him was very interesting. And I was wondering if the two of you could kind of comment on that.
Ajax, do you have any thoughts before I jump in?
Why don't you take it first, and then I'll chime in if I have anything to add.
Sure. Well, I think exactly how Speer got the job, so to speak, is I think a little bit unexplored in the book, at least from my recollection. But I think from just kind of listening to him basically talk about his life and his interactions with Hitler as well, my impression of his personality, I think, was kind of the main reason why he fit that role, so to speak. It seemed like he represented to Hitler what Hitler actually wanted to be in his life. And I also think that what Speer was a guy that was at least outwardly very humble to a guy like Hitler, and he was able to not undermine Hitler's ego, so to speak, and it gave Hitler a chance to sort of see through the eyes of this protege of his that he could vicariously do all these amazing architectural works that were sort of popping up all over Germany before the war started. And so that seemed to be kind of like their sort of compatibility. I mean, Speer was relatively tall. He, was somewhat handsome, I suppose, very intelligent, but very soft-spoken, and so he didn't really kind of disturb Hitler's ego. So Hitler had this impression that he could kind of slip notes to this guy, and then he could actually carry them out, whereas he would be too busy with the politics of running the country, but he could have all this fun, doing these architectural things, which he secretly sort of enjoyed, probably more than anything else. So it was sort of a personality thing that I think they had kind of this kinship, at least in the early years. When the war started and things started going bad, that relationship started fraying, but I think in the early period, there was sort of this personality match that I observed.
And I would say that sort of the other aspect of this question is the lack of talent at the top. And
the Nazi Party? Or?
Yeah, in the National Socialist Party leadership right at the top. They just didn't have, sort of by the nature of their sort of recruitment process, they just didn't have a great amount of talent at the top of the leadership. And you can sort of see this in Speer's youth, his relative youth. I think he was like 35 or 36 when the war broke out. Maybe a little older, but he was in his mid to late 30s when the war started. And I think he was handed, I have it in the outline, I won't be able to find it quickly probably, but I think he was handed power before age 40. 1942 when he was given, in February, I think, 1942, when he basically became boss of the war economy. Mm-hmm. He was under 40 years old, which is really remarkable, I think. And you can see this in the aftermath of the war. You have all the Nazis were young. You have the old generation actually come back in and sort of pick up the pieces, with Konrad Adenauer being, quite an old man when he took charge of West Germany. But the way that Speer sort of stumbled into being associated with Hitler was quite random. I think he was teaching a course, maybe a math or an architecture course, and his students just invited him to come see Hitler speak. And, right. He was impressed and pointed out how Hitler, had a great presentation and tailored his presentation to meet the audience's expectations or desires. But, it wasn't, this was just some revolutionary going around, stirring up crowds. That's how he met. It wasn't through elite network channels. And so Hitler really lucked out in that he did get this, organizational genius just randomly, but much of the other leadership was not even close to the quality of Speer. And you have people like Hermann Goering, completely incompetent, or some of the other characters, none of whom are quite as bad as Goering. But anyway, I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that sort of incompetence shows itself during the war, especially. I think Goering's talent was his political intelligence. He was able to manipulate the people around him to such an extent that he was pretty instrumental in getting the Nazi Party to where it got. But once the war started, operationally speaking, he just couldn't hold the candle to Speer. But we're going to, I think, talk about that a little bit later. let me actually look at the sort of outline chronologically, so we can focus our discussion today right up until the war started, because this is a big book, and so I think we'll talk about some of the lead up to Speer joining the Nazi Party, meeting Hitler, and then kind of what those early days were like, and kind of all the euphoria surrounding Germany's seeming revival, and then some of the little projects that he got himself involved in. Probably most notably the Zeppelinplatz, where they held the Cathedral of Lights, which I think was, in Speer's recollection, his proudest architectural contribution. Which, and if you go to Wikipedia, you can see this epic photo of what it looks like. And
yeah, I do have a question about kind of his. So it's difficult when you have kind of the default cultural filter that is sort of like, oh, modern architecture is great. Like, the less it looks like a building, the better. The more it looks like a brick, the better. But kind of the reputation that I've just kind of heard by anecdote of Speer, like, as an architect, is that, like, his primary skill, to the extent that he had some, was just, like, making stuff really big. But that, like, they don't actually consider him that great of a architect.
Right.
And
yeah, he
I
actually
find that completely surprising, considering the sources I've probably heard that from. But kind of how good of an architect did he himself?
Did he consider himself? Is that what you said?
Right.
It's hard to tell, because I think one of Speer's strengths, to be honest, is his sort of ability to do a humble brag, and he's kind of hard to know completely, because I think one of his abilities in getting to where he got was that he didn't upset too many of his enemies, and he had this modesty about him. Whether it's genuine or not, I'm not sure, but I don't know if he regarded himself as a good architect. He kind of had this sort of self-ingrained, self-deprecating nature that I think probably is very helpful for anybody in life, but I didn't get a whole lot of arrogance coming from him. Whether that was, just an act or not, I don't know. But there's a particular chapter that has an intriguing title called Architectural Megalomania. And so if he's going to call his own architecture megalomaniacal, it probably implies that he considers it not the most refined and excellent as he perhaps would like it to be. And then he also made this very interesting comment, because at a certain point when he had gotten his sort of very prestigious role during the early days of the Nazi government as chief architect, he had his father come visit him, I think, who was also an architect, and he gave them a tour basically of Berlin, where they were putting up these gigantic government buildings made out of stone and just these sort of really imposing looking structures. And I think Hitler at one point wanted to repave the entire, I forget the road, but it's basically this big highway that goes down the center of Berlin, and he wanted it to rival Paris's Champs-Élysées, which is Paris's most famous thoroughfare. And they were, I think, doing that construction for that. And his father basically said, "You guys are crazy. You're going way too big in scale and scope on this."
Right. The triumphal arch that they envisioned building was something like, it was like 5 or 15 times larger than the Arc de Triomphe in Paris. It was just some absurd multiple of that arch.
Yeah, and they were supposed to build the Capitol Dome sort of in a similar fashion as the one in Washington, D.C., but I think they ran out of material, and it was going to be like 3 times as big or something. It really was.
Yeah, and this is like sorry.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, this is sort of a point I would challenge revisionists with, like people who try to, in my view, kind of whitewash the Nazis like too much. I mean, there's definitely they're not the demons that we've been raised and trained to believe that they are. But they also did call their plans for their capital city Welthauptstadt Germania, like world capital city Germany, basically. Like this is not this is not a hard to interpret what that means.
It does seem like Speer kind of makes that connection explicitly. That, like, just based purely almost on their architectural aesthetics, that you could tell, like, this guy is like designing for world conquest. Like, this is not the Toledo City Hall. This is like intended to be a world imperial capital.
Right. Yeah, he does explicitly say that. And I wonder if that's him looking at it in retrospect, but I mean, it does look pretty clear when you look at the architectural plans. I mean, and I think also Hitler specifically asked Speer to go on assignment to take a look at some of the ancient empire architecture from like the Roman days, and then bring some of that back. And there was a lot of insight, I think, into Hitler's personality based on some of these trips that he had to take, because it revealed sort of some of Hitler's ambitions as well as insecurities regarding what he wanted for Germany and how he saw Germany's past. And I think there was an example that Speer brought up about how Himmler, who had sort of been the guy in charge of the SS and who was very into kind of replacing Christianity with paganism and something very kind of Germanic rather than, not Germanic in origin at least. And he was doing all these little architectural digs around Germany and pulling up pieces of wood and straw and just evidence that the architecture of pre-modern Germany was not super sophisticated compared to what they were putting together in the Mediterranean civilizations. And so Hitler basically agreed with him. He's like, why is Himmler doing this stuff? It's sort of embarrassing. Like, we don't want to have that sort of architecture, and we don't want Germany to feel like that's where they're coming from. We want to aspire to be impressive and have all these really monumental structures that truly do last the test of time. And I think he called it having ruin value. So if you go to if you go to modern day Greece or Rome, you actually see the ancient civilization partly still intact, because all of the structures were built out of these materials that just simply would last. That being rock as opposed to wood. And so I think that was very illustrative of what Hitler was trying to do. He was trying to build an empire that would last, and he called it a 1,000-year Reich. So I think that in itself sort of sums it up.
Did he ever make a kind of explicit comparison with the sort of Soviet architecture, or even for that matter, the kind of American like New Deal style architecture going on at the time?
Talking about Speer?
Yeah, because like there's a photo on his Wikipedia page that I thought was pretty dramatic from the 1937 World's Fair, where you have like a Soviet pavilion with the kind of Soviet realism, with it's like a big like concrete like block, very imposing, bureaucratic almost looking structure with this figure, like striding towards the glorious Soviet future. And then like on the other side, like clearly intended to be like 50 feet higher, is the German pavilion, which like almost looks like it shares like similar aesthetics, except for it's got a giant Nazi eagle on the side, on the top, and it all seems to look kind of very similar to if you wander around Washington D.C. Look at kind of some of the steel buildings, the 1930s architecture. Like I think the Department of Labor is a good example, where it's like Neo-Greco-Roman, but with giant bricks of concrete, the same sort of aesthetic. And I'm wondering if all these kind of ideological movements had some shared DNA between them. And I'm wondering if that was reflected in the architecture, or if he was consciously reflecting some of that in his architecture.
I remember just one. I don't remember him actually citing the Soviet architecture as a source of inspiration, but I would imagine, just like modern architecture, a lot of these guys study similar things, and so they're probably getting material and inspiration from similar sources, and probably not contemporaneously. They're probably looking to older sources. So I would imagine that the stuff that Washington, D.C. was built after the War of 1812 or something, or was the architecture that we see today.
Well, a lot of the architecture only dates from like the 30s, when there was just a big increase in the bureaucracy.
Right. Okay. So you're talking about the sort of New Deal buildings rather than the kind of Capitol building and
not the Capitol Rotunda itself,
right.
But stuff kind of built like the big office buildings that you see kind of like around downtown DC, particularly the ones with like the Soviet-looking sculptures up front.
Ajax, why don't you jump in real quick? But the only thing I remember about Speer's coming across, or even like bringing up the topic of Washington, D.C. was, I think, when he was dealing with Hitler, and Hitler basically said that he doesn't want Berlin to become Washington, D.C. because it was actually, in Hitler's eyes, very artificial. It was basically just a bunch of bureaucrats in the central area of the city, rather than Berlin, where it's a little bit more organic and you have actual businesses. And this, I think, was more true back then than it is today, because after, obviously, the reunification of the country, they moved all the government buildings, which are kind of brand new, into the city, and it was sitting in this island of economic decay. So this is talking about pre-World War II Germany. But at the time, I think it was more of he wanted to have kind of more of a Paris, frankly. That was a very common theme from Hitler. He wanted to rival Paris. It wasn't so much Washington, D.C. or Moscow. But that's what I remember.
Yeah, I wouldn't want to speculate too much, because I am not an architecture guy, but I would suspect, as Endgame has said, that it was just, these were the ideas, these were the new building techniques, relatively new building techniques that were floating around at the time, and that's kind of what they had to work with, and they sort of, converged on a similar sort of look. But I don't know for sure. Certainly, like the neoclassical, to me, the Nazi era architecture sort of has a neoclassical look to it, and that's, I think that, if memory serves, that style became popular after about 1910. That's sort of the first skyscrapers in America were neoclassical, and they would have Roman columns or faux Roman columns on the outside, and they'd have marble or some sort of fancy stone casing, but it would be a 30 or 40 story sort of small skyscraper. And I think that's kind of what influenced both Speer and the Soviet architects was, now they had relatively cheap steel, so they could build tall, that in a way that it wasn't possible before. But at the same time, they didn't know what else to make a building out of except for concrete or stone. It just was kind of an alien idea to make a building out of glass or some sort of other material. So they sort of made buildings that kind of looked like designs from the past, but on a scale that wouldn't have been possible in the past without a steel skeleton to put the stone around.
Yeah, and I think one thing that always struck me about my visits to Europe was that it didn't have that sort of New York skyscraper feel. It really was kind of, you're more big and broad. And places like Berlin seem to have that character as well. There's one building in particular that I always was personally fascinated by from the Third Reich period, was the Reichschancellery.
Oh, yeah.
Hitler's sort of headquarters, basically. And for me, and Speer goes into like why it was designed this way as well. But for me, it was always sort of very clear why it was designed the way it was, which was, let me describe it. It was basically this big monolithic thing that you would walk into, and you would see just this gigantic hallway in front of you going horizontally away from you as you step into the building. And they had these, I think it was huge marble walls and floors and columns, and then these like very elaborate chairs that would sort of make you feel very insignificant. And so as you walked in, you sort of saw what Germany was supposed to be in sort of Hitler's vision. And this thing got blasted to hell when the Russians came in.
Yeah.
And I think it's a parking lot now. I think they sort of try to humiliate them.
A lot of the stone is actually used in the Moscow, because it's great stone, this red marble or whatever it was. They moved a lot of it into and used it to build the Moscow subway line.
Yeah, and I think there's a big war memorial too that they have jutting out of the ground. I've never been to Moscow, but I've seen pictures. But yeah, it looks like very, very nice marble.
I mean, you can say what you want about, maybe certainly like the sculpture of the Third Reich was not very good, but almost cartoonishly bad. But and maybe the architecture isn't, sublimely whatever, like great, but this is good architecture, especially compared to what we have now. This is like the last period of, inspiring architecture, both in Germany and in the U.S. Really, after 1945, it is all downhill.
Well, I think this is actually what sort of Hitler observed when he sort of took over, is that he said, the current headquarters for the government is, quote, fit for a soap company, unquote. And I think this is this sort of commercialism that has sort of taken over the West, that you have, people just basically going out for profit, and so you cut costs and you cut corners. And so you see that in the architecture. I've always sort of been frustrated by the modern buildings with all this glass and steel. Yeah, it's sort of shiny and new looking, but it really doesn't have the sort of depth of feeling that you get out of the stonework. It just doesn't have it. And I think Hitler was aware of that, and Speer probably was sort of playing off that theme quite a bit. And just before we move on from the Reichschancellor, I think this is actually where Speer got the attention of Hitler. He was involved in architecture before this, but he was put in charge of this project, and he finished it on under budget and ahead of schedule. And that really impressed Hitler, especially for a key project like this. And so at that point, he was like Hitler's buddy. And so he was inviting him up to his over Salzburg little palace. He called it the Berghof, the mountain house, where he had kind of his retreat, where he'd kind of hang out with all his cronies and then have dignitaries once in a while show up there. I think Chamberlain went up there one day and met him there up on the mountain. And so at that point, he was in. That was the inner circle entry, I think.
That's a good segue, because I kind of wanted to ask about his impression of the kind of, personal management style, you could call it, or like personal leadership style. Like particularly the couple of chapters around like a day in the chancellery and the stuff around there. Like it sounds like from his kind of description that there were just like a lot of toadies, and like kind of whether by intention or just by virtue of the sorts of personalities involved, they tended to kind of like spend a lot of time like backstabbing or kind of like keeping an eye on each other. What was kind of your impression of his description of the kind of day-to-day banal like existence of like Nazi like government?
Well, I think the nature of any dictatorship sort of encourages obedience, and so I think was something Speer observed, is that people had to kind of watch above and below them, and they had to be very, especially above, to be careful of not. I'll look at my notes more, but that was sort of the general comment I think he made about that.
I think that this is like, I'm not trying to signal too hard against the poorly maligned Nazis here, but I seem to remember that he gave the impression that they had a system where no one wanted to have underlings who were clearly smarter than them. And I think Speer and Manstein are maybe the two figures whom I'm aware of that are clearly smarter than their boss, or at least in their domain, they're more competent than anyone else, and they don't do anything to cover it up. They're sort of open about being competent.
That could be why they weren't as so obsequious as maybe the other people were, because if you truly are capable, you don't need to kiss ass as much, arguably. Because your worth is apparent, so you don't need to flatter so much, and you also don't need to just lie like a lot of these guys were doing. I mean, they would just. For me, it was I think it was Bormann, who was the secretary of Hitler, and Himmler that really disturbed me. Those guys just. I wouldn't trust them, with a $1 bill. I mean, these guys would renege on anything, as far as I could tell. That was my general impression of a lot of these guys.
Yeah, it definitely seems like he's, I wonder how much of this is, I don't doubt that like the general thrust of it is accurate, because like, from what I've seen, like the interior workings of most governments tend to attract like pretty reprehensible people. The higher you go, with very few exceptions, dominated by just, as you said, sheer competence. But I wonder how much of the kind of almost quasi shit talking, if some part of that was like motivated by just like a desire to distance himself from some of these people politically. Because at the time that he was writing this, there was somewhat of a push to rehabilitate a lot of the old ex-Nazis as part of a way of kind of rearming Germany, reintroducing Germany as like a full-fledged member of the community of nations. And if like, some of these more personal aspects are perhaps like not even necessarily overblown, but he was like sure to include everything.
What could you expand on that?
Yeah, so this I'm mostly just looking at this outline of like a day in the Chancellery, about specifically like the very petty actions, like Bormann, sending his kids to like Hitler school, essentially, like as a punishment. Is like Hitler's
summer camp. Camp Hitler.
Hitler's negging of Ava Braun, essentially.
Is that what he was doing?
That's totally. Because it's like Ava is like hanging out, like doting on him, and he's like, check out that like tall blonde Aryan goddess over there, and like Ava just kind of wilts. I don't know how much to read into that whole very odd dynamic.
Okay. Yeah, we could talk about Hitler and his women if you want. There was some insight from this book actually on that, because Speer would observe how Hitler would treat Eva, and he didn't think it was very respectfully. But Yeah, also just the scene that was sort of hanging around Hitler at the sort of over Salzburg stuff, I think was kind of also very telling. A day in the chancellery, though, that's more like government stuff. And so I think that's where, he's talking with his cronies in Berlin, which was sort of a different crowd than his hiking buddies, whatever the hell you contrast that with up in the mountains. So yeah, just pick one. Which one do you want to focus on?
Yeah, let's talk about the kind of personal aspects, because especially in like a dictatorship like that, it seems like a lot of the political aspects do end up getting dominated by the personalities involved. So,
certainly, yeah. Okay, so what is your question about specifically?
So what was let's just go with the thing that you had mentioned immediately before. Like, what was like Hitler's relationship with women, in as much as Speer noticed it?
Okay, so Speer's perspective was that Hitler was very, very callous to his. I mean, he didn't even admit it to most people that he was even seeing Eva Braun until I think much later into the regime, and I think he married her on the day they committed suicide, and so that tells you something right there. But it wasn't even sort of publicly known, and it wasn't even privately that well known that he was with this woman. And my read on it, and through Speer's eyes a little bit, was that Hitler was doing a couple things. One, he was doing the sort of political calculation that, okay, as the sort of rock star of Germany, I want to sort of be single and available to all women, and sort of be that untainable guy that they go crazy for. And we've all seen the footage of all those young women sort of watching him as he drives by in his open air Mercedes. And so that part, I think, is sort of the cynical calculation. But I also think on a personal level, Hitler, and maybe not Eva in particular, but just in general, I think he was a very jaded person. He just had not really had a lot of happiness in his life. And so he didn't, I think, fully feel like he could trust anybody, especially women, because when you let somebody like that into your life, you have to be vulnerable. And I think he was a very insecure person. I don't think he wanted to be very close to anybody. And I think that's the main reason why he was that way with Eva. I don't think it was anything in particular about her. It was just more who he was. And that was more sort of my read on it.
And he also mentions like a bunch of the higher ups. Like, I guess Goering was a morphine addict. Bormann was screwing everything that moved. Goebbels was constantly cheating on his wife. It seems like a very kind of hedonistic thing. And there were also like a large number. I didn't see this in the outline. But wasn't like a homosexuality like also an issue with some of the top-ranking Nazis?
Well, that was the guy Ernst Röhm, I think is his name. Yeah, they killed him.
Right.
Okay. I don't think that was a big thing. Maybe I'm wrong on that, but that's the only person I'm aware of. So, Ajax, if you have more knowledge than that. Yeah.
I've heard it proposed before that from people kind of vaguely on our side, not people who would have any particular reason to slander Hitler, that Hitler himself may have been a homosexual. Like, there's no evidence that he ever actually had sex with Eva Braun. His maids allegedly would check the sheets because they were nosy, I guess, and wanted to know what was going on, and there was like no evidence that they were having sex. And I guess this is lame, but like worth pointing out that Hitler designed all the uniforms for the for the regime.
I thought it was Hugo Boss.
Yeah.
Oh, was it? Maybe I was misinformed. Yeah, it was Hugo Boss.
I think so. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that's what I'd heard. At least he was the manufacturer.
Maybe it was like that Hitler. I haven't read this myself. I was just told this by an educated person.
The Hitler collection.
Yeah, the fall Hitler collection.
I don't know. I mean, I've actually debated this myself as to whether he was homosexual or not. I think the way Speer put it was that Regarding women, Hitler was a cynic. I don't know. I think he really just had sort of had a really unhappy life, and I think he just didn't feel like he could connect. That was my main impression.
Yeah.
I thought at times he may be homosexual because he didn't have the. Here's the thing about him. He extremely insecure, and so his sort of thing about his whole image is power. He has to project power at all times, and so for him to sort of relax and sort of be seen with a woman shows a soft side to him, and I think he was very reluctant to show that, especially after he'd become chancellor. In his earlier years, however, there's a lot of evidence to show that he had had affairs with women, and there's even a speculation that he had impregnated somebody on his tour in France in the First World War. And he has a son or something. So who the hell knows? But it's for me, I just see the guy as a very bitter person, and especially as he's gotten older, he didn't have a very soft side to him anymore.
Yeah, and we're prone to over-sexualize everything in the 21st century.
Yeah.
And so it's almost impossible for us to imagine, just because of the decadent culture we live in, that someone would just be celibate. You know, like, there's people did that. People do that involuntarily, but people did that sort of voluntarily up through the, I guess, until the 50s and 60s. You know, it was seen as a sort of a moral weakness, actually, if you were philandering.
And to that point, like, I read some books about the kind of interior workings of the Soviet government contemporaneously. The Court of the Red Tsar is very good. And they're very explicit about the point that in that context, they were very almost ascetic with their living. The whole degenerate dakas on the Black Sea thing only happened much later. The Soviet leadership essentially lived like monks, and they were very strongly encouraged to not be promiscuous, to not have lots of affairs, and a lot of them did seem to have that same sort of living pattern. So who knows? It could have been just kind of some of the spirit of the time.
Are you guys there?
Yeah. Well, I'm thinking of other great men who, weren't sexually active, like Nikola Tesla. Obviously, he's not really up to the same sort of project as Hitler, but he still has this incredible will and incredible genius. He was seemingly celibate his whole life.
I think I had read somewhere at some point in my life that somebody looked at Hitler and said, "This guy was just so ambitious; he just didn't have time."
Yeah,
he's just so maniacal in his focus. And look, we don't know. There's a lot of interpretations and sort of somewhat limited data. So, I think everybody can kind of make up their own mind on this one.
So here's an interesting thing. You had mentioned this kind of maniacal focus, which is if you were going to kind of distill one thing from depictions of Hitler, it would be this kind of not even personal one-on-one charisma, but this sort of driving ability to electrify crowds. In 1938 or so, by this outline, he starts taking injections of lots of amphetamines.
Yeah.
Definitely see it kind of reinforcing, because obviously there was something there to begin with. But if you start looking at side effects of just being really hopped up on speed, it's aggression, focus, paranoia. It's not too hard to see some of these being exacerbated by the drugs.
Yeah, and actually, as we sort of examine history of world leaders, more and more of my study reveals that a lot of these people, in addition to Hitler, were on drugs. John F. Kennedy had been taking painkillers for an injury he had suffered during the Second World War, I think. And there seem to be a lot of people in Washington, D.C. as well who seem to be on drugs. Rob Ford in Canada is also the probably the most recent famous example. But yeah, it's sort of a high pressure job, and I think especially if you have put your whole life's work into it, it seems to be somewhat more common. I mean, you mentioned Goering before. He also was a morphine addict. And I don't know of the other leaders. I don't think Speer had gotten into this.
No.
But, yeah, it seemed to be kind of a thing. And also the awareness of the detriments of drugs, I don't think were as high back then. So I think it was a little bit less taboo to do this sort of thing. But you're certainly right. Hitler, in particular, had a sort of addiction, I suppose, to amphetamines. Yeah.
One of the other things I had a question about, so it seems like Hitler was not in favor of kind of exporting National Socialism per se, and that he was not a fan of kind of the Western very like Oswald Mosley or the Dutch guys. I guess Picard, Quisling. These kinds of guys who you would expect to be kind of very ideologically affiliated. I don't know if you could talk a little bit about that.
Well, my memory of Hitler's view on nationalism was that each country needs to figure out what makes sense for itself, because National Socialism, the Nazi Party, and its platform was designed for Germany. And so he viewed Mosley in particular, and if you look at the pictures of Mosley, I mean, it's kind of a joke, because he has like the same mustache, but he grew it out like an inch on both sides, and he has the same uniform, and his armband is like a sort of red and black, but different symbol, and it's just like, dude, I mean, come on.
He's just copying, yeah.
Yeah, come on, dude. It's like that's sort of his first instinct, I think. But also, I think he genuinely believed that all countries should have their own system, and so that was my interpretation of that whole trend.
It seems to comport with like this idea that like in a lot of ways the Nazis were kind of like non-ideological in a sense. Like it's right there in the name, like the National Socialism, but like all of the kind of economic policy seems
it certainly was less ideological than perhaps what we were all taught in high school, but I think the ideology was primarily of a political nature. I don't think the majority of the leadership in the Third Reich had much of a business or economic background, and so I don't frankly think they had much to say on the topic, and I think that's the main reason why they didn't have a whole lot of ideology around it. And they sort of delegated that towards the industrialists who had backed them. And I think that could be why. But you're certainly right. Like in terms of just how they ran the economy, it was very ad hoc. And actually, I think Hitler said that was somewhat of a strength of theirs, as opposed to the Soviet system, where everything was pre-planned out and controlled and very inflexible. So, Ajax, what did you think about how flexible or ad hoc or ideological the Nazi regime was?
Well, I suppose National Socialism doesn't have the sort of very deep flaws that communism has, that full economic planning and full state ownership entail. But it wasn't, I don't think we should say it was we didn't want to overstate how flexible it was. I mean, one of the statistics that stood out for me was that Germany, believe it or not, never actually hit peak World War I ammunition production. Right. And it was largely due to some bureaucratic hurdles that even Speer wasn't able to get over. they were shooting, I think in like 1944, they had something like 30 or 40 rounds per month. So that's all ammunition types. 30 or 40 rounds per month per soldier, which is like shockingly low to me, it seems.
Like less than your average police department.
I mean, like the average gun enthusiast in America probably shoots like 100 rounds a week, or whatever. Maybe not the average, but like the top 25% of gun enthusiasts will shoot, more than the average German soldier had in the largest war in history. It's just shocking.
We may want to save some of the sort of the war.
My bad.
But no. But real quick, just to sort of explain some of that, sort of as it ties back into how the system itself was set up. I don't know if the nature of World War II is the same as the trench war of World War One. And I remember there was like a number pops in my head, like, and actually I think I calculated it based on what the book had written down, but it was something like an average soldier would only see something like 9 bullets fired a day at most. I think it may even be less, but I'll look at that number again. But it struck me, and it seemed like that the war may have had a different tone. But you're right. Like there was sort of explicit commentary from Speer that the bureaucracy of the Third Reich was very stifling, and so they had to go through layers and layers of approvals and stamps and sending it up to your Gauleiter or whatever is in charge of your district. It did seem to have an extra layer of red tape that the previous war didn't have. So yeah, it certainly wasn't like laissez-faire capitalism.
But that said, I've seen interviews before with World War II, Wehrmacht soldiers, and one of them stands out. The guy's talking about his experience, and this is just some video that his grandson had shot and put on YouTube. So it wasn't, it wasn't done by a professional company. It wasn't presumably ideological. And he just sort of said off the cuff that something like, quote, "Things were so good under Hitler." So I think as flawed as the economy was, it was good for the working class, at least in the short term.
Let's talk about that, because the economy was such a huge reason why Hitler arguably became chancellor. So I'll put that out there and then let you guys respond, but I have some thoughts as well.
So the kind of what I have heard about and it's very important to like distinguish the pre and the post-war way that this hashes out. I have heard that the kind of, if you look at the polling data about like where their actual base of support was from, it was not the kind of lower class people who mostly tended to vote social democrat or communist. It was a majority kind of middle class phenomenon. Where they were very concerned about kind of preserving their savings from either confiscation should a communist regime take charge, or from destruction via inflation. And there certainly, was the same sort of, economic program as in the U.S. and a lot of other countries of like these kinds of mass building projects of construction of highways and like governmental buildings and dams and whatnot, which is probably not a great way to run your economy for perpetuity. But compared to Weimarian Great Depression, looks pretty attractive.
Yeah, I remember I visited Germany once, and there was a museum that I think it was actually in Nuremberg that showed how the NSDAP, Nazi Party, went from something like somewhere in the sub tens in terms of like voter share to I think the majority, or the plurality at least. And that thing almost happened overnight because what happened was the Great Depression. You can time it. You look at the timeline. It's like a big chart that they drew in the museum, and it basically started in 1929 when the Great Depression started, and that's when Hitler basically got his base of support.
Right. Hitler came to power on deflation. It was, something like 10 years after the hyperinflation, actually.
Interesting.
Yeah, it was a deflation in the similar way that the U.S. had a deflation. And, that's a great way to just cause massive unemployment. And, just a small point.
Okay. And talking about unemployment, I think if you guys have the exact numbers, that'd be great. You can always look them up, listeners, on Wikipedia pretty easily. But if memory serves, it was roughly something like Germany had an unemployment rate. I think it was worse than America's. And this is the real way of calculating unemployment, I believe, as well. Like basically, if you have a job, you're employed. If you don't, you're unemployed, rather than you're looking or not looking, as we do it here in America today. But back then, I think it was calculated whether you have a job or not. And the percentage of people that didn't have a job, I think, was maybe 30% in Germany, which was pretty catastrophic considering that most people back then had families. And then if 30% of your population can't support its family, people start starving. So yeah, it was bad. It was really bad. And I think when Hitler took over, it was through works projects, and also I think this armament stuff that people teach us. But I think actually the infrastructure projects were actually more of a contributor to the employment gains in Germany. I think the unemployment rate went down to somewhere around 5 or even lower percent after Germany.
Yeah, and they also had a expansionary monetary policy. They stopped. I don't know the details off the top of my head. I don't remember when they broke from the gold standard, but they did depreciate their currency a great deal, which helped a lot.
Yeah, I have seen also claims being made that basically the economic policy was kind of unsustainable enough that essentially the German economy was like running in obviously they were like running a deficit, but that they were like kind of depreciating quickly enough that for the last kind of 6 years they were really funded primarily via war loans, and that like kind of without new conquests their economy was not terribly sustainable.
You think Germany depended on conquest for its economy?
I have seen a couple of books to that effect. That a lot of their kind of investments were not terribly efficient,
Okay.
and they had a lot of kind of subsidies for kind of traditional modes of production. At the same time, they had like a very cozy relationship with large business interests that weren't terribly dynamic, but like were
Right.
kind of sole source for a lot of stuff that was being consumed by the government.
Yeah, they had a corporatist, I think, relationship with a lot of big companies. I don't know if they had any particular. I don't think they had a small business administration like we do. Not that that would be a good or a bad thing necessarily, but I think it was sort of. I think if memory serves, not from Speer's book, but just like some other documentary I watched, it was basically like Hitler's view on National Socialism was that, and he kind of literally like did a lot of this thinking on the back of napkins. He really didn't go into a whole lot of analysis and numbers. Obviously, he was just sort of philosophizing. But he wanted to draw a contrast with communism and capitalism. And so he was like, well, we're not going to take everything over. But for the key industries, that are important to the nation, basically they're going to have a lot to answer for to the government. And we have a lot of things to tell them. But the rest of the economy, you can kind of be free and have your own savings account, and that encourages initiative. And I think in Speer's book, he does mention something like that, where they didn't want to stifle everybody.
Yeah, we're starting to run up against kind of more specialist areas of knowledge.
Sure.
Sure.
And it does go outside a little bit of the book. But I do think it's good to bring this stuff up because it's kind of what was going on around the country and what was going on.
Yeah, I think like particularly kind of as we kind of lead up to the beginning of the war, and like when Speer kind of takes a more active role in managing the economy, a lot of these things sharp relief.
Certainly. Yeah. Did you have more questions?
No. I think the war itself is going to be some pretty fertile ground for discussion. So I'll defer some of the questions that are more pertinent to that.
Yeah.
That's really Speer's. Where Speer really shines is when he gets the job as boss of the war economy.
Yeah, it certainly became. I think there was a very famous telling from some of the soldiers that captured Speer, and they interrogated him basically as to, where are the positions of these key industries and such. And these were, I think, American military officers doing this, and they basically reported back to their commanders that this guy's knowledge of how things work is extraordinary. I mean, he has everything in his head. So yeah, he certainly was an incredibly talented person, and his talents were put to full use when he became in charge of the economy, and specifically not the economy, but the production of armaments. That's what his focus was, which was obviously a key element to the war effort. So I guess with that, we'll maybe bring it to a close. And any closing thoughts from you gents, before we wrap up?
I don't have anything. No.
Okay. All right. Well, I guess we'll see everybody next time. And then our next topic will be about Germany at war. All right. Thanks.
Excellent.
They wanted to kill me.
Because you're mad! Don't you see that? What you're doing to Rome?